Hi, it's me, the godlike son of classical music. Now, if you look at my other videos, most of them are about musical theater, but the only thing that I like just as much as musical theater is history. And lately, I've been pissed off because you cannot look at anything about Christopher Nolan's new Odyssey movie without a bunch of neckbeard armchair historians in the comments going, "The armor in the boats aren't historically accurate." And this is an absolutely asinine take for many reasons. I mean, it should tell you something that the people who make these arguments aren't historians or people who are concerned with Homer. You get a bunch of nerds who are obsessed with looking smarter and better than everyone else, who have some kind of weird fucking superiority complex. And the reason why this argument makes no sense is because there is no such thing as historical Homer. Asterisk. I'm gonna get into what that asterisk means later, but we're gonna start with part 1, the Homeric question. The Homeric question is as follows. Who the hell is Homer? And this isn't just me. This isn't saying like I've never met the guy personally. Like historians literally do not know, 1, who Homer was, and 2, if Homer was even a real person. A big reason for this is because if Homer was real, then he would have lived during a period known as the Greek Dark Ages, or right on the tail end of that. And the reason why it's called the Greek Dark Ages is because after a series of catastrophes befell the Greeks, they lost their written language and became essentially illiterate. So there are no records of this guy. There is no, we know Homer was born in this year and died of this year, and he lived in this place, and this is what he did during his... No, we know nothing. We know literally nothing. And that brings me to part 2. Homer is not historical. If you're going to use any text or any piece of evidence as a historical source, you need to ask yourself first, is this source credible? For example, I could say that during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong imported a bunch of Somalian super soldiers, and that's how they won the war, and that's why America lost. And the first thing you would probably ask me is, okay, what's your source for that? And if I said my source was, of course, the website Albanian Nationalist 69historyblogs.com, then you might tell me that's not a very credible source. That's kind of along the lines with what we're dealing with here. We do not know if this source was a real person. I mean, hell, we don't even think Wikipedia is a credible source most of the time, and they have citations. Now, you may be asking yourself, if the Greeks in this time period lost their written language and they were all illiterate, then how come I can go to Barnes & Noble and get the Iliad and the Odyssey in book form, translated, of course, by Emily Wilson? And this is because during the Dark Ages, when the Greeks were illiterate, they would have told these stories by word of mouth. They would have recited them. And if you've ever played the game Telephone with some friends, then you know this is not an effective method of communicating history. It does not take long for the content of those messages to get all jumbled up and fucked up. It's because of this, a lot of historians don't see Homer as one person. Rather, they refer to Homer as the collective Homeric poets who, over the centuries of telling these stories, each kind of put their own spin and made their own additions. It's kind of a Homeric remix. Everything's a remix. One of the big ways we know that this is true is because the Homeric poems themselves have a lot of anachronisms. If you don't know what anachronisms means, it's what a lot of people are accusing Christopher Nolan of. It's when you have a story that takes place in a certain time period, but you have elements that are from a very different time period. For example, in the Odyssey, iron is mentioned a whole bunch. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey famously take place during the Greek Bronze Age. In the historical setting that they take place, the Greeks would not be using iron, they would be using bronze. Now, the Homeric poets knew about this to some extent. If you read the Iliad, you know that their armor and their weapons are all made of bronze. It's kind of like the poets knew that they used bronze in this time period, but they didn't understand why they used bronze in this time period. The poets were like, yeah, okay, we know that their weapons and armor were made of bronze, but they must have had iron, right? Like, we have iron today, right now. So they must have had it back then. So it must have been that they make certain things out of bronze and they make other things out of iron. But this, of course, we know now historically is not the case. And this is kind of the crux of the counter argument in a lot of people's defense of Christopher Nolan, is that these stories are inherently anachronistic. These stories were created by people who lived centuries after the events that they were depicting, and they knew nothing about those events. Iron is one example, but take a look at some of these artistic depictions of the events of the Iliad and the Odyssey that were made during the ancient Greek period. This armor looks more similar to Christopher Nolan's armor than it looks to the actual armor during the Bronze Age. The Greeks were just as anachronistic and ahistorical in the telling of the Odyssey than Christopher Nolan is, because the point is not history. Okay, this brings me to part 3. You guys are just dumb. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of an analogy here. Okay, so stay with me. The Odyssey is a story about a guy who goes on an unexpected, very long and grueling journey. It's definitely a period piece, although it's not historical and the events depicted are not historical. And along the way, he meets a bunch of different creatures and monsters, and yeah, the Odyssey is the ancient Greek equivalent of Lord of the fucking Rings. The Lord of the Rings is set during a quasi-Middle Ages time period, but of course, that's not what swords looked like back then. That's not what armor looked like back then. And guess what? Nobody cares, because that is not the point. J.R.R. Tolkien did not write Lord of the Rings for people to use it as a historical source or to study history or to be any kind of depiction of history. And the exact same thing is true for Homer. The Homeric poems are likely loosely based on real events. For example, we have archaeological evidence from the city of Troy, and it shows us that around the time period that the Iliad would have taken place, the city got completely destroyed, so that has been a pretty compelling piece of evidence that the Trojan War was a real historical event. But as far as we're concerned, all of the Iliad and all of the Odyssey is complete fiction, just as fictional as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And I would make the argument that although the events of these stories are not historical, they do have something to tell us about history. For example, you may know that Tolkien was kind of inspired to write The Lord of the Rings based off his experiences fighting in the First World War. You have themes of camaraderie, for example, that tell us about the time period that J.R.R. Tolkien belonged to. And a similar thing is true for Homer's epic poems. Although we don't learn much about the events that they depict, we do learn a lot about the values and the perspectives of the authors who wrote these pieces. I'll give you a couple examples. One example is xenia. Xenia is a Greek word that basically translates to like hospitality. During the Odyssey, Odysseus and Telemachus both make journeys into neighboring Greek provinces. And while they're there, as is custom, the king is very kind to them. The king offers them a place at the dinner table, gives them plenty of food, plenty to drink, a place to stay, lots of treasure. And this was huge in Greece during the time period that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written. If you're receiving other Greeks from other provinces, you are expected to treat them with utmost hospitality. And in the Odyssey, this is contrasted to non-Greeks from far-off regions. For example, there are the Lystrygonians, who are giant cannibals and try to kill and eat Odysseus and his crew. There's Polyphemus the Cyclops, who immediately begins also eating Odysseus's crew. In other words, the Greeks identified themselves with these values, and they contrasted themselves with other people from far-off lands because they do not have the same values. It's a big way that the Greeks othered foreign people. They viewed themselves as more civilized because they have these values, whereas other far-off people are barbaric, they're monsters, they're cyclopses, because they do not think in the same way that the Greeks do. You also learn a lot about kleos, which is another Greek word that roughly translates to glory or honor. In the first 4 books of the Odyssey, Telemachus is just going and visiting kings who fought alongside Odysseus in the Trojan War. He is going on his own journey and making a name for himself, earning some kleos. You also learn a lot about loyalty. Hell, Penelope waited 20 years for Odysseus. She didn't remarry, she didn't get with any of the suitors, nothing. She waited 20 years under the assumption that he was probably dead, but she didn't know for sure yet. And that's why it's incredibly reductive to look at the trailer for Christopher Nolan's Odyssey and say, this is not historically accurate because the armor's wrong. I mean, is that what you people think history is? Do you think when I was at UCLA studying history, they're like, okay, these are the most important things you need to know. You don't need to know about Third Reich, FDR, who the hell is that? What is important is that this is a Spitfire, this is a Panzer, this is an MP40. History is more than armor and weapons. There's a lot of y'all out there who need to hear that. You're not a history buff if you can name all the guns that they used in World War II. And similarly, you're not a historian for calling out Christopher Nolan. You're looking at a story which is well known among historians to be more or less purely fantasy, and y'all think you're gonna be smart for saying it isn't real, it isn't real life. Guess what? There also weren't Cyclopses. There also wouldn't have been Scylla and Charybdis. There wouldn't have been giant cannibals. There wouldn't have been gods, immortal gods that came down to earth. No part of the events in the Iliad and the Odyssey are historical, period. Odysseus wouldn't have gone to the underworld. None of that happened. And just like how it would be asinine to shit on Lord of the Rings for being historically inaccurate, it is equally asinine to shit on Homer for being historically inaccurate. And notice I don't even say Christopher Nolan here, because it's not Christopher Nolan's fault that these stories aren't accurate. Take it up with Homer, you stupid bastards.